The chalk dust hung in the air like a shroud. The professor thought his tenure protected him, but in Harlem, tenure is granted by only one man, and he just walked in. Chapter 1. The Ivory Towers Crack. The air in the classroom didn't smell like the Harlem streets. Out there on the corner of 125th and Lenox, the air was a thick soup of diesel exhaust, roasted peanuts, and the heavy metallic scent of ambition. But inside these walls, the air was sterile. It smelled of floor wax, old parchment, and the cold, dried dust of chalk. It was a world of logic, a world of rules. Or so the professor thought. Dr. Silas Sterling enjoyed the sound of his own voice. It was a practiced, mid-Atlantic trill that suggested he had spent more time in London than in the boroughs. He paced the front of the room, his mahogany-soled shoes clicking against the linoleum with the precision of a metronome. He was a man who believed that knowledge was the only true currency, and because he held the keys to the vault, he believed he owned the depositors. In the third row sat Elise. She was 22, with eyes that had seen the hard edges of the Depression, but a spirit that had refused to be blunted by it. She was Bumpy Johnson's niece, not by blood, perhaps, but by the deeper, more permanent bonds of Harlem loyalty. To Bumpy, Elise represented the future he was building. She was the legitimate side of the legacy. While Bumpy handled the numbers and the weight, Elise was meant to handle the books and the law. She sat with her back straight, her fountain pen moving across the page in a graceful, rhythmic dance. She wasn't just there to learn, and she was there to transcend. Sterling stopped his pacing. He stopped right at Elise's desk. The clicking of his shoes ceased, leaving a silence so sudden it felt like a physical weight. The other students, sons of doctors, daughters of the few black elite, didn't look up. In a room like this, you kept your head down. You didn't interrupt the man with the power to sign your future into existence. Miss Vance, Sterling murmured. His voice had dropped an octave. It was no longer a lecture. It was a confidence. Your latest essay on the reconstruction of the Southern economy, it was ambitious. Elise didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on her notebook. Thank you, Professor. I put a great deal of research into the labor statistics. Statistics are cold, Elise, Sterling said. He leaned down, his hand coming to rest on the edge of her desk. His fingers were long, pale, and manicured. They lacked the personal touch, the nuance that a man of my experience can provide. He didn't move his hand. Instead, he let his pinky finger brush against the back of her wrist. It wasn't an accident. It was a territorial claim. In Sterling's mind, Harlem was a jungle, and he was the high priest of the only temple that mattered. He viewed the girls who came through his doors as fringe benefits of his tenure. He assumed that, because they came from the shadows of the tenements, they would be grateful for the light he deigned to shine on them. Elise felt the skin on her arm crawl. She knew the look in a predator's eye. She had grown up in the shadow of the greatest lion in the city, but Bumpy's violence was always purposeful, a tool used to maintain order. Sterling's gaze was different. It was oily. It was the look of a man who thought he could take what he wanted, because nobody would dare to speak against a man of his stature. I think, Sterling whispered, leaning closer until she could smell the sherry on his breath, that you and I should discuss your grades privately, my office, after the evening bells. There are concessions that can be made for a student of your potential. The word concessions hung in the air like a threat. Elise looked up then. She didn't look afraid. She looked at Sterling the way Bumpy looked at a crooked cop, with a calm, devastating clarity. She saw the smallness of the man. She saw the cowardice hidden behind the tweed jacket and the Ph.D. I don't think that will be necessary, Professor, she said, her voice steady and clear. My work stands on its own. Sterling's face didn't redden. It tightened. His eyes turned into flint. He withdrew his hand, but the insult remained. We shall see, Miss Vance. In this room, I am the judge, the jury, and the executioner of your ambitions. Without my signature, you are just another girl from the blocks. Remember that. He turned on his heel and returned to the chalkboard, the screech of the chalk against the slate sounding like a scream. Elise didn't write another word that night. She closed her notebook. She tucked her pen into her purse. She realized then that the ivory tower wasn't a sanctuary. It was just another street corner, and the man at the front of the room was just another extortionist. But Sterling had made one fatal mistake. He thought he was dealing with a girl who had no one. So he didn't realize that when you touch a daughter of Harlem, you don't just answer to her. You answer to the man who owns the air you breathe. As the class dismissed, Elise walked out into the cool night air. She didn't head for the library. She walked toward 125th Street. She walked toward the center of the storm. Chapter 2. Whispers on 125th Street. Harlem at night doesn't sleep, it breathes. It breathes the blue notes of a saxophone from a basement club and the rhythmic hiss of steam from the grates. It's a living, breathing organism, and every organism has a nervous system. When something goes wrong on the periphery, the signal travels instantly to the brain. The brain of Harlem sat in a corner booth at the Celebrity Club. Bumpy Johnson didn't need a throne. He had a circular table with a white linen cloth, a single glass of scotch that he barely touched, and a view of the front door. He wore a midnight blue suit tailored so sharply it looked like it could cut the smoke drifting through the room. He wasn't talking. He was listening to the rhythm of the room. The band was playing Mood Indigo. Slow, somber. It matched the weight in the air. The door opened, and the cold wind of the street followed a young woman inside. It was Elise. She didn't look like the other women in the club, the ones in sequins and fur. She looked like a student. She looked like the promise of a better Harlem. But her shoulders were tight, and her eyes were fixed on the floor as she navigated the tables. The room went quiet as she approached Bumpy's table. The regulars knew. You didn't approach the man unless invited, but Elise didn't need an invitation. And she was the one thing Bumpy cherished more than power. She was the reason he fought for it. "Uncle Ellsworth," she said softly. Bumpy didn't look up immediately. He finished a thought in his head, then raised his gaze. His eyes were like polished stones, calm, deep, and impossible to read. He gestured to the seat across from him. "You're late for dinner, Elise," Bumpy said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of a heavy door closing. "And you didn't go home first. The chalk is still on your sleeve." Elise sat. She didn't cry. You didn't cry around Bumpy. He didn't value tears, he valued truth. She told him about Dr. Silas Sterling. She told him about the office hours, the hand on her wrist, and the way the professor had used his position like a bludgeon. She told him about the concessions. As she spoke, and Bumpy's expression didn't change. He didn't slam his fist, he didn't curse. But the men standing behind him, the shadows in overcoats, felt the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees. Bumpy reached out and gently brushed the chalk dust from Elise's sleeve. His touch was light, almost fatherly. But his mind was already miles away, calculating the geometry of a response. "He's a teacher," Bumpy said, more to himself than to her. "A man who's supposed to lift the veil, not pull people into the dark." "He thinks he's untouchable," Elise whispered. "He told me that without him, I'm nothing, that the street is all I'll ever have." Bumpy looked at her then, a small, cold smile playing on the corners of his mouth. "He's half right. The street is a hard mother. But he forgot who owns the street." He signaled to a waiter. "Get the lady some tea. Honey, no lemon. She's had a long day." Bumpy stood up. He was a man of moderate height, but when he stood, the room seemed to shrink. He adjusted his cufflinks. To the casual observer, he looked like a businessman preparing for a late meeting. To those who knew the history of the 5 boroughs, he looked like an avalanche. "Go home, Elise," Bumpy said. "Study your books. Don't worry about the professor. He's about to enter a very intensive research phase." He watched her leave, ensuring she reached the car he had waiting outside. Only then did he turn to the man on his left, a man named Whispers, who lived up to his name. "Tell me about this Sterling," Bumpy commanded. "He's high society boss," Whispers replied. "PhD from the Ivy Leagues. Big house in Sugar Hill, He thinks because he's got doctor in front of his name. The rules of the pavement don't apply to him. Bumpy leaned back against the mahogany bar, looking at his reflection in the mirror. He saw a man who had spent his life building a wall around Harlem, a wall meant to keep the predators out. And here was a predator who had grown up inside the walls, wearing a suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Power is a funny thing, Whispers, Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. Some men think it comes from a piece of paper on a wall. Some think it comes from the fear they put in the hearts of the weak. But real power comes from the respect you earn by protecting those who can't protect themselves. He took a slow sip of his scotch. The burn was clean. This professor thinks he's teaching a lesson, Bumpy continued, but he's skipped the most important chapter. He hasn't learned about the cost of an insult. He hasn't learned that in this neighborhood, you don't touch the crown jewels unless you're ready to lose your hands. Bumpy put the glass down. It made a sharp clack against the wood. Find out where he spends his nights. Find out who he owes. Find out what he loves. I don't want him broken yet. I want him isolated. I want him to feel the walls of his ivory tower starting to shake. The music in the club picked up, a faster, more aggressive tempo. The night was moving. The gears of the Harlem machine were turning, and Bumpy Johnson was at the lever. He wanted a private session with a student, Bumpy said, heading for the door. He's going to get a masterclass from me instead. The door swung shut behind him, the cold Harlem air swallowing his silhouette. The hunt had begun, not with a roar, but with a quiet, calculated silence. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Fear. Bumpy Johnson did not believe in haste. Haste was for the desperate. It was for the small-time hoods, who thought a loud voice and a fast trigger made them men. Bumpy moved with the deliberate, crushing weight of a glacier. He knew that the most effective way to destroy a man wasn't to strike him. It was to remove the ground from beneath his feet. The next morning, Harlem woke up to a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Bumpy didn't go to the university. Not yet. Instead, he took a walk. He walked through the corridors of the community that the professor looked down upon from his lectern. But he stopped at a shoeshine stand on 116. He sat in the chair, his back straight, looking out at the morning traffic. The man at the college, Bumpy said, his voice barely audible, over the snap of the shine cloth. Sterling, tell me about his habits. The shiner, an old man who had seen 4 decades of Harlem's secrets pass by his feet, didn't stop his rhythm. He likes the high life, Bumpy, but he's cheap. He drinks the good stuff on other people's tabs. He's got a weakness for the cards, too. Down at the back room on 132nd. He owes the wrong people. Bumpy nodded. He didn't need to hear more. He knew the type. A man who projects an image of moral superiority while drowning in the very vices he condemns in others. By noon, the architecture of the professor's isolation was being built. Bumpy made 3 phone calls. The first was to the owner of the backroom game on 132nd Street. The professor's debt, Bumpy said. Buy it, all of it. I want the paper in my hand by sundown. The second was to the head of the janitorial union at the university, a man who owed Bumpy his daughter's medical bills. I want to know every room he enters, every girl he talks to, every drawer he locks. I want the keys to his world, but I want him to keep the illusion that he still holds them. The third was to a man who lived in the shadows of the law, a fixer who knew the ledger of every respectable man in the city. Bumpy spent the afternoon in his office above the pharmacy. He wasn't looking at ledgers or counting cash. He was reading a book of poetry. He valued the precision of language. He valued the way a single word, placed correctly, could change the meaning of a whole stanza. He applied that same logic to his business. Around 4 p.m., a knock came at the door. It was a janitor from the university, a man named Samuel, dressed in his gray work uniform. He looked nervous, holding his cap in his hands. Mr. Johnson, Samuel said, clearing his throat, I did what you asked. I found this in his desk. He keeps a ledger of his own, names, grades, and dates. Not just a lease, sir. There are others, many others. Bumpy took the small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped through the pages. His eyes didn't widen, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. It was a catalog of coercion. Sterling wasn't just a harasser. He was a predator who had turned the pursuit of education into a toll road. You did well, Samuel, Bumpy said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills, sliding a $100 note across the desk. Go buy your wife something nice. And Samuel, don't go back to work tonight. Tell them you're sick. I don't want you there for what comes next. Bumpy stood up and walked to the window. Below him, Harlem was buzzing. People were coming home from work. Children were playing in the spray of a fire hydrant, and the life of the neighborhood was in full swing. He felt a heavy sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about a lease anymore. It was about the integrity of the community. If a man like Sterling could prey on the brightest minds of Harlem without consequence, then Bumpy's order was a lie. Whispers, Bumpy called out. The shadow moved in the corner of the room. Yeah, boss? The professor has a late-night seminar tonight. Economics, ironically enough. I think it's time he had a guest lecturer. Bumpy picked up his hat, a gray fedora with a black band. He brushed a microscopic speck of dust from the brim. Does he have security? Whispers asked, checking the weight of the .38 in his waistband. He thinks he does, Bumpy replied, his voice cold and flat. He thinks his title is his shield. He thinks the walls of that university are thicker than the laws of the street. We're going to show him that there isn't a wall in this city that can keep me out when I have a debt to collect. Bumpy walked out of the office. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a man of consequence, heading to a serious meeting. But as he stepped into the black Cadillac waiting at the curb, the air around the car seemed to vibrate with a silent, controlled fury. And the professor had spent his life studying the distribution of wealth. Tonight, Bumpy Johnson was going to teach him about the distribution of pain. Chapter 4. The Late Night Seminar. The university at midnight was a graveyard of ambition. The grand, Gothic arches of the limestone buildings cast long, skeletal shadows across the quad. Up here, on the hill, the air was thinner, colder. It was a place designed to make the common man feel small, a fortress of intellect meant to intimidate the uninitiated. But Bumpy Johnson didn't see a fortress. He saw a house of cards. Inside the faculty hall, the lights were mostly dimmed, save for one window on the third floor. Dr. Silas Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk, the green glass shade of his banker's lamp casting a sickly emerald glow over a stack of essays. He was sipping a glass of expensive port, his fountain pen hovering over a student's work like a guillotine. He felt safe. He felt like a king in a kingdom of ink and paper. The heavy oak door to his office didn't burst open. It didn't rattle. The lock simply yielded to a skeleton key with a polite, metallic click. Sterling didn't even look up at first. I told you, Samuel. I don't want the floors waxed until Thursday. Leave us. Samuel isn't coming in tonight, Doctor. A voice rumbled from the doorway. It was a voice that didn't belong in an office. It was a voice that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates, heavy, ancient, and utterly certain. Sterling froze. The nib of his pen dripped a single black bead of ink onto a student's paper. It spread like a bruise. He looked up, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. And Bumpy Johnson stood in the doorway. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't have his sleeves rolled up. He looked like a man who had just come from a gala, immaculate, composed, and devastatingly calm. Behind him, the silhouette of Whispers leaned against the doorframe, hands buried in the pockets of a long wool coat, eyes fixed on the hallway. Mr. Johnson, Sterling's voice cracked, the mid-Atlantic trill replaced by a high-pitched tremor. I'm not sure I understand. This is a private office. This is a place of education. Bumpy finished the sentence for him. Bumpy walked into the room. He didn't rush. He paced the perimeter, his fingers trailing over the spines of the leather-bound books on the shelves. The Wealth of Nations, The Republic, The Prince. You have a lot of books here, Silas, Bumpy said. And then he used the professor's first name like a discarded cigarette. A lot of words, a lot of theories on how the world is supposed to work. how men are supposed to govern one another. Bumpy stopped at the window, looking out at the lights of Harlem glowing in the distance. But you seem to have a problem with the practice, Bumpy continued. You teach economics, don't you? Supply and demand, labor and capital. Sterling stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. I don't know what you think you're doing here. If this is about Elise Vance, I assure you, there has been a misunderstanding. Her grades are simply not. Bumpy turned. He didn't move fast, but the air in the room seemed to vanish. He walked to the desk and sat in the guest chair, crossing one leg over the other. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out the small, black ledger Samuel had found. He placed it on the desk. The professor's face went the color of ash. This is a ledger of concessions, Bumpy said softly. It's a very interesting read. It tells a story of a man who uses a grading pen like a shakedown artist uses a lead pipe. It tells a story of a man who thinks his position gives him the right to touch things that don't belong to him. That's private property, Sterling stammered, reaching for the book. Bumpy's hand didn't move, but his gaze pinned the professor to his seat. Sterling's hand stopped inches from the ledger, trembling. In Harlem, Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade against the skin. Everything belongs to the people who live here. The air, the music, the pride of our women. You're a guest in this house, Silas. And you've been caught with your hands in the silver drawer. Bumpy leaned forward, the green light of the lamp reflecting in his dark eyes. You told Elise that without you she was nothing. You told her the street was all she'd ever have. Bumpy paused, letting the silence fill the room until it was deafening. The street is where I live. The street is where I keep the peace. And when you insult the street, you're talking to me. Sterling tried to reclaim his dignity. He straightened his tie, though his fingers wouldn't stop shaking. You're a criminal, Johnson. A gambler, a racketeer. You can't touch me. The university board, the police, they won't allow a man like you to intimidate a man like me. Bumpy smiled. It was a slow, tired smile. And it was the smile of a man who had already won the game before the opponent even knew the rules. The police are busy, Silas, and the university board. Well, they're about to receive a very detailed report on your private tutoring sessions. But that's for tomorrow. Tonight is about the curriculum. Bumpy stood up. He walked around the desk, moving into the professor's personal space. Sterling backed away until he hit the wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. You wanted to teach Elise a lesson about power, Bumpy said, standing so close that Sterling could smell the faint scent of cedar and expensive tobacco on his suit. But you forgot the first rule of the classroom. Bumpy reached out and gripped the professor's chin, not with violence, but with a terrifying clinical firmness. He forced the man to look him in the eye. You never lecture a man who has already mastered the subject. Bumpy turned to whispers. Clear the hall, Bumpy commanded. The doctor and I are going to have a private seminar, and I want to make sure he doesn't miss a single word. Whispers nodded and stepped out, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking back into place echoed through the room like a gunshot. The ivory tower was no longer a sanctuary, it was an interrogation room, and the professor was about to learn that in Harlem, the highest degree you can earn is the one that allows you to keep your life. Chapter 5. A Different Kind of Education. The silence in the office was heavier than the darkness outside. It was a thick, suffocating thing that pressed against the professor's chest. Bumpy didn't move. Then he stood there, a shadow against the emerald glow of the desk lamp, watching the sweat bead on Sterling's forehead. The professor was a man who lived by the clock, the class bell, the office hour, the dinner reservation. But in this room, time had stopped. You see this desk, Silas? Bumpy asked. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. He ran a gloved hand over the polished mahogany. It's a fine piece, solid, sturdy. It gives a man the illusion of distance. You sit behind it, and the world seems like something you can manage with a pen and a ledger. Bumpy picked up a heavy crystal paperweight, a globe of the world, trapped in glass. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its weight. But the distance is a lie, Bumpy said, with a sudden explosive motion that lacked any hint of anger. And Bumpy slammed the paperweight down onto the professor's hand. The sound was sickening, the dull thud of crystal meeting bone, followed by the sharp crack of the mahogany splintering. Sterling didn't scream at first. The shock was too deep. He stared at his hand, pinned to the desk, his fingers splayed like broken wings. Then, the air left his lungs in a ragged, high-pitched wail. "Shh," Bumpy whispered, leaning over the desk until his face was inches from Sterling's. "Don't ruin the silence, Silas. We're in a hall of higher learning. Respect the environment." Bumpy didn't let go of the paperweight. He kept the pressure constant. "This is the first lesson," Bumpy said, like gravity. "You thought you were up here, looking down. But gravity always wins. It brings everything down to the dirt, eventually. No, even a man with a PhD." He lifted the paperweight. Sterling pulled his hand back, cradling it against his chest, his breath coming in jagged, sobbing gulps. His manicured fingers were already turning a deep, angry purple. The ivory tower was bleeding. "You like to touch things that don't belong to you," Bumpy continued, stepping around the desk. He moved with the grace of a panther in a cage. "You think because you have a title, you have a right. But in my world, a title is just a target if you don't have the character to back it up." Bumpy reached out and grabbed Sterling by the collar of his tweed jacket, hauling him out of the chair. He slammed him against the bookshelf. The wealth of nations in the Republic tumbled to the floor, their pages fluttering like dying birds. "I'm going to teach you about the redistribution of assets," Bumpy said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the stack of papers he had acquired. The professor's gambling debts, the signed markers from the backroom games, and the detailed testimonies Samuel had gathered. He held them up to Sterling's face. "By tomorrow morning, these will be on the dean's desk, and the morning after that, they'll be in the hands of the district attorney. You won't just lose your job, Silas. You'll lose your house, your car, your stature. You'll be a predator without a forest, just a broken man in a gray suit, looking for a place to hide where the people of Harlem can't find him." Sterling's eyes were wild, darting toward the door. "Please, Johnson, I have money. I can pay." Bumpy let out a short, dry laugh. "You think I want your money? I own the banks you borrow from, Silas. I want the one thing you can't buy back. I want your pride." Bumpy leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying glacial calm. "You told Elise she was nothing without you. You told her she was just a girl from the blocks. Now, look at you, crying in the dirt, begging a man from the blocks for your life. Who's the nothing now, doctor?" Bumpy didn't hit him again. He didn't have to. The violence of the truth was doing more damage than a fist ever could. He watched as the professor's spirit simply curdled. The man collapsed into a heap among his fallen books, a pathetic figure of tweed and terror. Bumpy adjusted his fedora. He looked down at the broken man with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "The pain in your hand will go away in a few months," Bumpy said, walking toward the door. "But the pain of being a nobody? That stays with you forever. Every time you walk past a school, every time you see a girl with a book, you're going to remember this room. You're going to remember that you're only alive because the man you looked down on decided you weren't worth the bullet." Bumpy opened the door. Whispers was waiting in the hall, a silent sentinel in the dark. "We're done here," Bumpy said. "What about the ledger, boss?" Whispers asked. Bumpy looked back at the office. The green lamp was flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The professor was curled on the floor, weeping into the carpet. "Leave it," Bumpy said. "He needs something to read while he waits for the sun to come up. It's the last book he'll ever own." As they walked down the long, echoing corridor of the faculty hall, Bumpy's footsteps were the only sound. He didn't look back. He had delivered the lecture. He had set the curve. And as he stepped out into the crisp Harlem night, he felt the balance of the world shift back into place. The professor had tried to teach a lesson in power, but Bumpy Johnson had just given him a masterclass in consequence. Chapter 6. The Standard of the Street. The sun doesn't just rise over Harlem, it earns its way in. It starts as a bruised purple over the East River, bleeding into a pale, dusty gold that catches the top of the brownstones before finally washing down to the pavement. On this morning, the light felt different. It felt clean. It felt like the air had been scrubbed of a persistent, oily film. Nor on the campus of the university, the ivory tower was waking up to a nightmare. Dr. Silas Sterling didn't walk out of his office that morning. He was extracted. The janitors, the same men he had spent years looking through, as if they were made of glass, watched in a heavy, choreographed silence as he was led out. He wasn't in handcuffs, not yet, but he was shackled by something far more permanent, the sudden absolute loss of his world. His tweed jacket was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and his right hand was swathed in a makeshift bandage of white handkerchiefs, already stained with the dark reality of his evening seminar. The scandal moved through the faculty lounge like a virus. The ledger Bumpy had left behind was a roadmap of ruin. It wasn't just the gambling debts or the predatory behavior. It was the meticulous documentation of a man who had sold his soul in small, untraceable installments. By noon, his name was being chiseled off the door. By sunset, he would be a ghost, a pinstriped warning to anyone else who thought their degree gave them a license to hunt the vulnerable. Down on 125th Street, Bumpy Johnson was back in his natural element. He sat in the window booth of a small diner, the steam from a cup of black coffee rising to meet the brim of his hat. He wasn't celebrating. There was no victory lap. To Bumpy, what happened in that office wasn't a triumph. It was a chore. It was the necessary maintenance required to keep a kingdom standing. Elise walked in 10 minutes later. She looked different. The weight that had been bowing her shoulders for weeks had evaporated. She carried her books not as a burden, them but as armor. She sat across from him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. In Bumpy's world, silence was the highest form of communication. It meant the job was done and the debt was settled. "I heard he's gone," Elise said softly. Her voice was clear, the tremor of fear replaced by the steady hum of a woman who knew she was protected. Bumpy blew the steam off his coffee. "Men like that are never really gone, Elise. They just moved to a different forest. But he won't be hunting in this one again. That I can guarantee." "People are talking," she said, looking out the window at the bustling sidewalk. "They're saying the professor had a change of heart, that he realized he wasn't cut out for the work." Bumpy offered a ghost of a smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. Perspective is a powerful thing. Sometimes a man needs to see the world from the floor to truly understand the height of the ceiling. He reached across the table and placed a small velvet box in front of her. Inside was a fountain pen, gold-plated, heavy, and inscribed with her initials. It was a tool for the future he had fought to preserve for her. "The professor told you that without him, you were nothing," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant frequency that commanded the very air in the room. "He was wrong. You are the reason I do what I do. You, and the kids on the stoops, and the mothers in the kitchens. If the legitimate world won't give you a fair shake, then I'll build a world that will. But you have to finish the work, Elise. You have to be the doctor, the lawyer, the judge. You have to be the things I can never be." He stood up, and the movement fluid and controlled. He didn't look like a man who had spent the night dismantling a human being. He looked like a pillar of the community. He looked like the man who kept the lights on and the wolves at bay. "Don't look back at the tower," Bumpy instructed. "It's just a building. The power isn't in the stone or the books. It's in the standard you set for yourself. And in Harlem, the standard is respect. Everything else is just noise." He stepped out of the diner and onto the sidewalk. The neighborhood greeted him in a series of subtle, rhythmic nods. The fruit vendor, the numbers runner, the beat cop. They all saw him. They saw the man who had reminded the world that Harlem was not a playground for the elite. It was a fortress of loyalty, and its gatekeeper was a man of his word. Bumpy walked south, on toward the heart of his territory. He knew that tomorrow there would be another threat, another predator wearing a different mask, another fire that needed to be put out before it consumed the block. But for today, the air was clear. The chalk dust had settled. He had taught the professor about pain, but more importantly, he had taught Harlem about its own worth. He had shown them that as long as Bumpy Johnson was breathing, The ivory towers would never be high enough to escape the reach of the street. As he turned the corner onto Lenox, the music from a nearby record shop spilled out into the air, a heavy, brassy jazz tune that felt like a heartbeat. Bumpy adjusted his lapels and disappeared into the rhythm of the city. He didn't need a statue. He didn't need his name in the papers. His legacy was written in the quiet safety of a young woman's walk to class and the cold, lingering fear in a broken man's heart. In the end, power wasn't about the violence you inflicted. It was about the peace you maintained. And in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was the only peace that mattered.